So first of all, welcome to our IEEE Solid State Circuit Society webinars for Young Excellence Program. My name is Cao Lei, and I am the committee member of SSCS Young Professionals. Young professionals and students are more than 30% of our overall membership, and they are the future of SSCS. As YP committee, we are trying to address the different needs and interests of our younger members with initiatives like this webinar series. Our aim is to offer these webinars on a quarterly basis. In the following 2 slides, I want to talk very briefly about some of the example benefits of SSCS membership for YP members, and also a few example activities of the YP committee. As an SSCS YP member, you can access SSCS Resource Center, which contains technical tutorials, short courses, and webinars. You can enjoy distinguished lecturers in your local setting. You can apply for travel grants, pre-doctoral achievement awards, and circuit design contests. And you can also develop leadership skills and make professional connections by becoming a local or a global YP leader. Please let us on your local section know if you want to become a YP volunteer. In the next slide, I want to also briefly cover some of the other activities that our committee has been working on. We have recently launched an online mentoring platform. With this platform, you can connect with leading SSCS mentors and mentees from all over the world at your own pace and time. Please check out this platform, register to it, and enjoy the mentorship on your pace and time. We have been organizing micro-mentoring sessions in SSCS-sponsored conference over a decade. Recently, as the conference are going online, these sessions are also going online. So we have organized our first online mentoring event as a part of a 2020 VLSI symposium with over 90 attendees. Please stay tuned for upcoming online events. And finally, Webinars for Young Excellence Program is a new webinar series dedicated but not limited to YP members. This new webinar series complements the monthly SSCS webinar program that focuses on technical tutorials and developments. Our inaugural episode, The Intersection of SSCS and AI, A Tale of Two Journeys, was held in May, and the second episode, To Academia or to Industry, that is the question, was held in August. As part of the webinars for Young Excellence, today we bring to you Do and Don'ts of Writing a Good Paper, recommendations from a former editor-in-chief, presented by Professor Bram Nauta. Professor Bram Nauta leads the IC Design Group at the University of Twente in Netherlands. He was the editor-in-chief of IEEE Journal of Solid State Circuits from 2007 to 2010. Moreover, he was active in the technical program committees of various SSCS conferences. He served as an ISSCC Technical Program Committee Chair in 2013. Bram also served as the president of the IEEE Solid State Circuit Society. In his various roles, he has experienced both sides of the publication process. So about the Q&A, you can use the Q&A section on your dashboard to ask your question. And we will select question and ask Professor Bram Nauta, and Bram Nauta will address them during the break and also after his presentation. So let's begin our webinar today. Professor Bram Nauta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kameng. Hello, everybody. I'm calling from the Netherlands. It's getting dark here. Slowly, people in Asia may be already sleeping. People in the West Coast US may wake up early. So this is the sweet time spot, time moment that the whole world can see each other. So I hope you like my presentation. I will turn off the camera to save bandwidth and come back to you later. I will now share my presentation. Is this visible?
Yes.
Complaints? Yep. Okay. Okay, welcome everybody to my talk about do's and don'ts about writing a good paper. And I've been editor-in-chief of the journal Solid State Circuits some 10 years ago, so it's quite long ago. But I always enjoyed it, and I saw a lot of papers coming in and papers going out, and it was a good experience. And I thought, well, let's share it with you guys, give some tips to write good papers. The outline of my talk is as follows. Let me get a pointer, laser pointer. So I have basically two sections of 20, 30 minutes each. First, I will tell how things work. So how our conferences are organized, how our journals are organized, and how do conferences and journals interact, because we want to publish at both. So this talk is not about only journals, it's also about writing conference papers. Then a break to ask some questions about this, also to make it not a too long session. And then about the writing itself. So really writing the paper itself through the outline, and then some general writing tips in general. Okay, let's first talk about conferences. They're very popular, or they used to be popular. In the past, it was mainly used for a fast publication, although the speed of journals has been improved a lot. In the past, you had to submit a journal paper on paper with a box with a lot of copies. It's now all electronic, so journals have become much faster, and conferences kept about the same delay in publication. So this is more an old advantage, but it's still relatively fast, but not the fastest. A conference in our field can also be just a smaller idea, so just a little VCO or a little trick, or a benchmark paper in which the circuits are maybe not new, but the numbers are better. So just get better numbers because you use a better technology. So sometimes papers are also accepted at the conference just to benchmark to get a good state-of-the-art number, even if there are no new circuit tricks. This is very important. If you submit a paper, it's just accepted or rejected. There's no way you can rewrite it and get another chance. So it has to be good right from the beginning. And that makes it quite hard to get a conference paper accepted. On the other hand, the papers will be accepted that may be incomplete. They may lack references. So that then they still like the idea. So it will be accepted. So yeah, the good thing about the conference paper, it's quite easy to get something in, but it may not be complete. So you may not cite the right state of the art. You may not cite the original inventor. So be careful in citing conference papers, because the reference list may be quite wrong or incomplete. So it's better to go to a journal for that purpose. So as an archival, it's less suited, because there is no rewriting of such a paper. Of course, a conference is very good for networking and for Q&A sessions. It's really a good experience. And yeah, in the past, you had to go to a conference to get the book, and that was it. Then we got compact disc, then we got USB sticks. But in the meantime, everything is already available on IEEE Explore a few months after the conference. So a conference used to be a place where you had to go to see the paper. But today, since it's on IEEE Explore anyway, a few months later, you can just wait and see all those papers. So the audience has also broadened up a lot. So which are our conferences in SSCS? We have a few major conferences. Most famous is, of course, the ISSCC, which is always in San Francisco. Also in the US, we have CICC. In Europe, we have the SCirc, which is together with SDIRC, the device conference. In Asia, we had last week, or this week, we had the Asian Solid State Circuits Conference. It's always in a country in Asia. And then we have the VLSI Symposium, which is sometimes in Japan and sometimes in Hawaii. It just alternates every 2 years. So I put it here twice. It's not a typo. It's just a conference that jumps from locations. So these are our Solid State Circuits fully sponsored conferences. There are, of course, more conferences, but these are our main conferences, and they are distributed over the year and also globally. In every region, there is one. So this is a bit an organization of a conference. There's something magic called IEEE, which I will not explain. And there's always a TPC chair, a technical program chair, who is responsible for the papers at the conference. There's also a general chair who is responsible for the food and the drinks and everything. But For papers, that's not so relevant. So you submit basically to a general point at the conference. There are subcommittees, for example, analog, wireless, wireline, digital. It's so these are expert groups, and every subcommittee consists of typically 10 people. And those 10 people, they decide if your paper will be accepted or rejected. So, and these names are known. So you can see from the website, who are these people? So they're not anonymous. You know who they are, but you don't know which TPC member liked your paper and did not, because some may like it, some may not like it, but they will not tell you. You will get just the overall results. Important is that a conference is deadline driven, so you have to work hard for a deadline. Only the technical program committee members vote. There are no external people involved. And as I said, there are no revisions. So if you make a little mistake, it will remain in the paper. And it's a binary decision. It's yes or no, and there's nothing else in between. If you look at the journal publication, the journal is important for an academic reputation. So if you want to get promoted or a job at the university, people normally count journal papers. They don't care so much about conferences, although in our fields, conferences can be very prestigious as well. Since it's reviewed and there are corrections made and clarifications through the review process that I will explain later, a review journal gives you a kind of quality stamp. So you are sure that the references are good and the measurements were done properly. The reviewers have asked all the questions they wanted to ask, and they should be answered in the journal. So that's more like a good quality stamp, and that makes it like an archive of your work. So it's really something like a little book. It's approved. A journal paper has a wider scope than a conference paper. It contains more theory. There's more technical information. It contains more educational parts, especially in the introduction, describing state of the art. And important, it includes much more references. So a conference paper typically has 4 or 5 references. Journals can have 20, 100 references. So that's more useful. So in general, journals are more appreciated, but conferences have their space, of course, as well. So which journals do we have in our IEEE Solid State Circuit Society? Well, we, of course, our Journal of Solid State Circuits. That's the most famous one, very prestigious one. It used to be rank #1 downloaded IEEE. That's not the case anymore, but we're still number 3 or 4, still high. It's not that we got smaller, but the other ones got bigger. 8 pages submissions. The papers may get longer during review because reviewers want to add something. And if you go over 11 pages, we now ask page charges, just to pay some extra money to get more papers printed. And that's also to prevent that papers get longer and longer and longer all the time. So there's like a little threshold to keep the paper compact. That's what we like. We like compact papers. And since we've done those page charges in IEEE Solid States, the papers just got shorter. So basically nobody pays them, but they make sure that the papers is just short enough, which is good. We also have Solid State Circuits letters that exist now 3 years. That's 4 pages, so really short. It's limited to 4 pages. So if you rewrite it, you have to remain within the 4 pages. So that's quite a challenge, because if you add something, you have to remove something else. It's fast publication, so typically 8 weeks after submission, you can have your paper published. And this is much faster than conferences. So where conferences used to be a fast way to publish, this is not the case anymore. This is faster. And this is also 4 pages, so it's about the same length as a conference paper. We also have Journal of Exploratory Devices and Circuits. That's an open access journal, so you can read the papers without being a member or having access to IEEE. And it's basically what are the future devices after CMOS. So suppose CMOS is not used at some point anymore, which I personally don't believe will happen soon. So there are new kind of devices, and then design circuits with that. So that's typically the people in the physics departments who invent new devices. And this is about circuits in those devices. So you can tell your friends in physics, submit your papers here. And then we as circuit designers can read it. So that's a nice way to showcase the physics work. We also have the Open Journal of Solid-State Circuits, which is basically a copy of the Journal of Solid-State Circuits. And we created that to be prepared for open access, which was Plan S in Europe. And in the original plans of Plan S, there was no hybrid journals were allowed. And hybrid journal is where you have open and closed access. And first they said, okay, we need a special journal, which is only open access. So we created this. But now it turns out that you can still go to Journal of Solid-State Circuits and just pay money and make it open access. So we're kind of struggling now with this Open Journal of Solid-State Circuits. Like, what shall we do with it? Shall we make more tutorial style? Shall we go to more systems paper? So we're currently under discussion, but within a year, we almost had no submissions at all. Because, yeah, our Journal of Solid-State Circuits is more famous, it has a good impact factor. So there's actually no good reason today to go to this journal. And we have the RFIC Virtual Journal that does not accept submissions. It's just a collection of papers from various journals of solid-state circuits, MTT, Microwave Society, and Circuits and Systems. And it has a special topic like phase noise or wideband receivers or power amplifiers. It's always about something RF. And then they collect a lot of papers from the last years. And there's always a good introduction tutorial style written there. So this is a nice journal if you want to dive into a subject. It's a bit like a book with a lot of papers added to it. It's virtual, so you cannot get it in print, but you can find it on IEEE Explorer. And then there are other journals from other societies. We have, of course, Transactions on Circuits and Systems, part 1 and 2, where this is more about the theoretical side of papers, but also measurements are, of course, allowed. And part 2 is just a shorter version. It has 5 pages, and it's also faster. There's the Transactions on Microwave Theory and Techniques, which is from the MTT Society. And there's also Transactions on VLSI systems, which is more on the digital side. And there's many more, especially outside IEEE. There are hundreds of journals, but their impact is much smaller than the IEEE journals. So the IEEE journals that I mentioned are really the main ones in circuits. So how is the journal organized? There is an editor-in-chief. He or she talks to IEEE. An author submits to the editor. Well, it's a website, but the editor opens it. And then assigns your paper to one of the associate editor, and they have the same role as the subcommittee chairs of a conference. They have their own expertise because maybe this person is expert in A to D converters, this person is expert in phasor loops or power amplifiers. And that person finds reviewers anywhere in the world. And that's good because you can really select people from industry, from academia, different parts of the world. So there's total freedom in finding reviewers. A journal has no deadline, well, except special issues, but you can just submit a journal paper anytime. And there's a huge reviewer pool. Basically, every author is also a reviewer. And you can have a lot of revisions, so you can really improve the paper. Sometimes it's being sent back to the author 4 or 5 times, but in the end, well, normally it's getting accepted as if the author listens to the reviewers, and then you have a good paper which is reviewed by those reviewers, and you have this so-called quality stamp, which is nice to have. So what did we do? We used to go to conferences, and we first published the paper at the conference. We enjoy the conference, you get the feedback, you meet people, you drink a beer, you party, and this is one of the hallways at ISSCC, and you can see how many people are packed at the conference. It's almost unimaginable today. And then you still want a journal paper because you want an archive of your work. So you hope for the invitation of the special issue. You have to wait for that. But it's also a bit of a gamble because the selection is kind of based on audience ranking, on technical program committee ranking, so it's a mix of different things that determine if the papers are accepted or invited or not. And normally, if you have a good oral presentation, then people in the audience like it, they understand it, and then you get the invitation. But you can also have a very smart circuit, which is not well explained by the speaker, and you will not get the invitation because the authors, the audience doesn't understand it, but it can still be a good written paper. So it's a bit of a gamble. It doesn't mean if you don't get the invitation that your paper was not good. And if you don't get the invitation, just submit it as a regular paper. Just do it. Don't worry. Everybody does this. And But you can only do this after the invitations have been made. So if you submit the paper earlier, then the editor will say, well, please wait for the special issue if you get the invitation. And then if not, only then you can submit to a regular paper. And that makes it slow because you first submit to a conference, you wait for the conference, and then you have to wait for the special issue. You don't get the invitation, and then you submit as regular paper. So overall, you lose 1 year in getting the thing published easily. Well, I think you'll notice that the world changed a bit because of this little nanoscale device. It's actually 10 nanometers big, so it's almost the size of our transistors, but this guy has more impact than our transistors. So yeah, seats are empty. And the conferences go virtual, hybrid, and I attended a few, I tried to attend, but I don't like it. It's less joy. You don't get feedback. People don't ask questions anymore during the Q&A sessions. People are shy to ask. There's a time zone problem also for this talk. So it's afternoon here in the Netherlands, but in East Coast or West Coast America, it's really early. And I attended VLSI online, but it started at 2 a.m. my time, so I cannot ask questions. So the time zone becomes a problem. Whereas if I would travel to Japan, it would be fine. But the good thing is, much more people can attend. So you can get much more people listening to your paper than otherwise. And also papers are recorded, so you can play them back. But the whole interaction and questions is basically gone. And of course, we have the special issues, which are still interesting. So if you get into the conference, you may get the invitation, which is also nice. But today you may as well also just skip the whole conference and go straight to a journal. And it may even go faster than a conference. So if you don't enjoy the conference, there is no interaction. You may just say, well, let's not go to a conference right now during COVID and just go to journals. And then SSCS letters is good because it's also 4 pages. So it's basically the same paper. You can just submit as a plan B if your conference doesn't happen. But of course, we hope we all get the conferences back again and that we can all meet face to face again and enjoy our field. So which type of work is suitable for a paper in our society? Well, the scope is all IC implementation oriented. So it has to be an integrated circuit. So it's not about microwave printed circuit design. It's not about pure modeling. It's not about only devices. It's not about pure software. It's really about chips. Also, we don't like too much mathematics in our society. So if you have this kind of stuff in your paper, you better go to TCAS. That's more appreciated and it's more about theory. Our reviewers don't like huge equations and they always wonder how practical is it? Is it really that important that this thing doesn't work? So in our society, there's less focus on mathematics, although sometimes mathematics can be really beautiful and powerful. We need a real IC. But to have a real IC is not enough. The work must be of high quality. And then we come to the question, what is high quality? Well, we need an innovative idea. So not just a combination of a known circuit, so not an op-amp and change the W's and the L and go to another technology and you just make an op-amp or a known circuit. So don't take a new circuit in a new technology or a combination of known techniques. So a diff pair plus a cascode is not an invention. It's just two standard techniques combined. But we always hope for a new concept or an invention, something that is making a breakthrough. And that's always nice if I see a paper like that. I always enjoy that, and reviewers especially enjoy that. And the idea has to be proven on a chip, and the idea must significantly advance state of the art. So we'd like to see better numbers. So this is difficult. You have to make a chip that works, a new idea, and it has to be better. And it's tough because it's not always better. But honestly, we don't have a journal about circuits that don't work, that doesn't exist. Although I probably would like it because it would save a lot of time. Maybe we're now working on a chip that doesn't work. So if somebody tried that before, it would be cool to find that. But somehow we don't publish this and we don't have a journal. But it could be actually a good idea to make circuits that don't work and publish it there. Before you submit, check your own pre-publication. So if you submit to a journal, you may have already been at the conference, and that's totally okay. So 90% of the papers submitted to Journal of Solid States, they have a pre-publication at one of our conferences, and that's totally fine because the journal will add something to a conference paper. All the conferences are available on IEEE Explorer, and that means that the journal papers should add significant information to all pre-publications, because else you can just read the pre-publications, which are the conferences. So IEEE does not allow double publication of the same work. And therefore, there is a pre-publication policy which is important. And this red sentence is important, is that a paper should be worth reading for a person who has read the conference paper. And this is not the slides, but the paper. So it should give basically a lot of extra information. And you also have double the number of pages, so that's also possible. So people normally add a better description of the state of the art. They add more theory, more proof of concept, more measurements is important, more discussion. So in case of mismatch, noise, non-idealities, you can really discuss this. You can analyze what happens, and more benchmark, more references, and more discussion in the band with benchmark. So you don't have to show extra new circuits because you already showed that, but we really like to see much more meat around the circuits, much more interesting stuff that people care about. And one tip is, don't reveal everything in the conference paper. So if you put everything above in your conference paper, so you write it super compact and try to squeeze in as much as possible, then you have the risk that if you want to write a journal paper, there's not much else to add anymore, and your journal paper will be rejected. So it's good to not discuss everything in detail in your conference paper, but just focus on the key idea in your conference paper. And then, since we publish first at the conference and then to journals, there are several things you can do in a certain order. And to go to a conference paper first and then go to the Journal of Solid States, that's fine, that's what we all do. If you take a conference paper and then you go to solid state circuit letters, well, that's not so likely, because a conference paper and SSCS letters are both 4 pages. So it's probably the same work. It's not very different. It's the same length. You cannot add something unless you remove something. So it's not likely that this is accepted. Another thing is, if you have an SSCS letters paper and then make it longer to go to the journal, that's also not likely, because that makes the SSCS letters paper later obsolete. So the editor of the Journal of Solid State Circuits, they warn you, like, okay, if you have already an SSCS letters paper, it's probably directly rejected because it has already been published. There are, of course, exceptions. For example, I write an SSCS letters paper about a VCO with very good phase noise, and my Journal of Solid State Circuits describes a complete phase loop, including that VCO. And then here I focus on the phase loop, and I just cite my own SSCS letters paper for the VCO, but I don't repeat the explanation of the VCO anymore, because that would be double publishing. So be careful. If you want to go for a journal paper, going to conferences is accepted, but this step is what we try to avoid, because it makes SSCS letters obsolete. So that means every older paper in SSCS letters is of no more relevance. And then, why do we have it? So think before you submit. Well, how does the journal review process work? Well, you submit to the editor, and you have to be honest about all your other submissions and to other journals and conferences. So there are many questions asked you, and you have to be honest. And also, if you want to submit the same work later to another journal, you have to tell the editor, like, hey guy, I submitted this also to one journal. So when I was editor, I saw a paper being received by me, and the authors did not say, well, they said this was the only submission. And later the reviewers found out that there were much more submissions, because they happened to be the same reviewers for all those papers. So they submitted it to 3 journals at the same time, and they were lying about that. And that's really bad. So they were put on a blacklist, and they were not allowed to publish for some years. So be careful, you may get blacklisted, and then you have a real problem. And there's an automatic plagiarism check done, and it also finds your own paper. So if you completely copy your conference papers, that's found and that's not acceptable. So you really have to rewrite the paper. You cannot just reuse all your text. Then the editor sends it to the associate editor with the right expertise. He sends it to, or she sends it to reviewers, typically between 3 and 6. And then there comes a decision. Well, that can be direct accept, but that's really rare. I think I've never seen this when I was editor. There's always some revisions, which can be major or minor. That's typically 30%, and typically 60% is being rejected. And 10% can be referred to another journal. It doesn't fit in the scope of our journals, or it's so bad that it's not even being reviewed. And this is not a democratic process. So there can be 5 reviewers who love your paper, and there can be 1 reviewer who hates it. But that reviewer may be the real expert, and maybe that reviewer says, well, that idea was done in 1952 and you don't cite that paper, so I reject it. You have to rewrite it and cite that paper. So democracy, although it's very good and people fight for it, but in this case, it's okay if it's not democracy. It's all about the quality. And if 1 reviewer finds a serious point in the paper, that is important. And then the other ones don't overrule that 1 person. This is a very important slide. It's about dealing with reviewers. And I always tell my students, the reviewer is always right, even if he's wrong. Because the reviewer is right, that's one option, but it can also be that the reviewer is wrong. He did not, or she did not understand it. But apparently you as author did not explain it well enough. And so you have to rework on your paper. And that's normally in the introduction. So you have to make clear what is the scope of your work in the introduction and explain all your assumptions. For example, if I talk about low power radio receivers and I forget to tell I'm talking about base stations, and then I have 100 milliwatt, then they say, oh, well, that's too much power. But if I would have explained it's for a base station, then it's actually quite low power. So you have to really tell what are your assumptions, and that steers the reviewer in a certain direction. That's very important, because if you steer the reviewer in the wrong direction, the reviewer may kill your work, where it may even be good work. So this is very important. So the reviewer is always right, and if the reviewer complains, he says something is wrong, and if you think it's right, then you just have to explain better. And another thing is important is don't answer to the reviewer. So if the reviewer say, can you say something about noise? Your answer should not be an explanation about the noise. No, you have to add a paragraph about noise in your manuscript and then tell the reviewer that you did that. So never answer the reviewer, because other people will also read your paper later and they will have the same questions. And you don't want 1 million emails about, hey, what about the noise in your paper? So you have to change the manuscript. So don't answer the reviewer. Just tell the reviewer, oh, that's a good point. I have changed my manuscript. I've added this and this and this. And then tell the reviewer that you did that. And don't talk to the reviewer. And many people make this mistake. Well, it continues like that. So you rewrite the paper, you address all the reviewer issues point by point, and the associate editor may organize a second review or a third review until it's accepted. And then the editor makes a final decision, which is normally accept if you're already there. And then you submit the final manuscript. And you're not allowed to make any changes anymore. So you're not allowed to remove acknowledgements to your friends, or remove references, or some competing references. You're not allowed to touch the manuscript anymore, because people can play games here. I've heard a trick that somebody did it. In the manuscript, he thanked Mr. X for the fantastic collaboration during the work. And then, of course, the editor does not send it to Mr. X, because the editor thinks they're friends. But in fact, Mr. X was the enemy, and the author just did not want Mr. X to be reviewer. So he put him in the acknowledgement. But if Mr. X would read that, he would be shocked later. So he removed the acknowledgement again. And that's not allowed. So you cannot change the paper anymore. And there's a real check on that. So it's important. Be careful. And then it's available. First of all, it goes online. So there's early access on IEEE Explorer. So if you go to our website, there's an early access button. You can see the papers So even now I can see the December papers coming up, which are ready. And this is very interesting. You can do as an alert. You get an email every month with the table of contents, so you don't miss any paper. It's a free service to all members. So it's really handy to subscribe to this table of content. I've done it myself for a lot of journals. So I get every month I get a nice overview with all the titles of the journal and other papers. And if you don't like early access, you can also wait for the printed version. You can see here my little stack. There's some unopened ones because it's just too much paper. And well, I stopped the paper submissions. It just became too much paper in my office. So I went now complete online. So that's how the process works for journals and conferences. I did not talk about how to write a paper. That's the next part. So this is the moment where I would take a little break and see if there's any questions about this part so far.
Okay, thanks. So we will have the first break and answer some questions from the audience. So just a reminder, you can use the Q&A dashboard to ask the questions and we will select and answer later on. So first question from our audience. What is the typical review timeline of JSSC?
Yeah, I'll turn on my camera. The question is, what is the typical review time? Is that the question?
Yeah, typical review timeline of JSSC.
Yeah, it's typically, I think the average is 70 days now. So it used to be 90, 100 days. It became faster. So it's typically 70 days. And there's now an automated system. So if reviewers are late, then there are automatically emails sent to the reviewers like, hey guy, you have to send your review in. So there's a lot of reminders. So.
Okay, so next questions. Are journal and magazine the same? So if not, what are the main difference between them?
The magazine is very different from the journal. So the journal has reviewed papers. It's pure novelty and technical work, whereas the magazine is more tutorial style. It's more about the people. It's more about meetings. So there may be an article about this lecture in the magazine that there were so many people and blah blah blah. So the magazine is really something else than our journals. It's really orthogonal. So it's what you see in the magazine you will not see in the journal and vice versa.
Okay.
Yeah.
And next, thank you. And next question. So you mentioned special issues for JSSC from conference paper, ISSCC or ASSCC. So do you know what the approximate percentage of papers are usually selected to submit to special issues from ISSCC?
Yeah, that's typically per issue, there are like 25 papers. So for the SSCS, Asian solid states, and CICC, I think it's around 20 papers. And at the conferences, there can be 100 papers easily. At ISSCC, it's 3 issues right now. So that's 60 papers from the 200. So I think roughly 1/3, 1/4, something like that. So you need to first get into the conference and then you need to get into the journal. So it's kind of tough to get that invitation. But I think it's 1/4 roughly. But it depends a bit on the conference. And some conferences they have less room in the journal, so there's always a negotiation going on. So every conference would like a lot of papers invited, and they prefer every paper to be invited. But the journal wants to keep the quality high, so there's always. So they want to make sure that every paper which is invited is really of high quality. But that doesn't mean that only those papers who are invited have high quality. There can be other papers with high quality. And that's why I say, if you don't get the invitation, just submit. And there's a very good chance that you get accepted. But for the invited papers, the acceptance rate is close to 80%. Whereas if you normally submit after a conference, your acceptance rate is like 30, 40%. So the invited papers have a better chance to get accepted.
Okay, maybe we have one more question. So if the silicon result was based on an older technology, will it affect the the view from the reviewer? Will they like it, or will they prefer some circuits that implement with a newer technology?
No, it's the question is, if you have an old technology, can you still publish? Yeah, I think so, and I really like that, because I think if you just get good numbers because of good technology, I think that's the quality of the technology guys and girls. It's not about the designer. So I think if you get reasonable performance in a really old technology, I think that's smarter than good performance in a good technology. So I always like good ideas, and I don't care so much in which technology they are. And you can take this into account. You can, in your introduction, you have to write, okay, I'm using this old technology. So that's also to tell the reviewers, like, okay, I have a trick, but be careful, I'm using an old technology. And there can be a reason, because it has to be cheap for low volume, or it has to be high voltage. Like 0.18 can do high voltage. 22 nanometer cannot do high voltage. So there can be reasons to go to an old technology. And then put it in the introduction and make that clear to the reviewer. And in your table, your comparison table, also put older papers in the same technology to compare with. Also new papers, but show that your idea is still better compared to maybe 10-year-old work in that technology as well. But if you write it well, it can work well. If you write only about numbers and focus on figure of merits, then you're lost. So that's why the introduction is so important.
Okay, thank you. And I think that's all for the this break. So I think it's waiting for your coming presentation. So let's continue with your presentation now.
Okay. I stop the video again. Yep.
Yeah.
And go to the share. There's the break. Okay, welcome back. So I just discussed how conferences and journals are organized, and now I will tell you about the writing itself. Okay, so your chip works, your idea works, and it's time to write a paper. So this is a typical outline of a paper, and I will go over this one by one to give you some tips and tricks. First, you start with the title, an abstract, introduction, the body, which is the main part of your idea, experimental results, discussion, very important, conclusion, and references. And I will go over all these things one by one. First, the title. A title is very important. You need a good title. So the title has to describe the paper, that's clear. Because if I get the table of contents from the mail of Explorer, the title should trigger me if I want to read the paper or not. So it should be an appealing title, and it should really want me to read the paper. The title should not be too vague. So if it's called a novel receiver, yeah, I have no idea what it means. Is it kilohertz, gigahertz, optical, wireline? And by the way, don't use the word novel anyway, because everything we publish is novel. So that's a title that does not have any meaning. Also, the word ultra low power, ultra low voltage, be careful, because what is ultra low power? If it's a base station, it's another number than sensor nodes. So you better say use 5 gigahertz, so much milliwatts receiver for base station applications. And if you don't put base stations applications in the title, then people will say, oh, that's too much power for me, I'm not going to read that paper. So don't be vague, but also put it in the right context, so the people really understand what is the value of your paper. But focus on what is exactly new. So if you have invented a technique, which is basically independent of the technology, independent of the numbers, like here, noise cancelling technique, that's a nice, broad, general technique. And that remains timeless. So you can still use the same, if you cite the paper 10 years later, it still has value. There's no, that titles like this don't age, but yeah, most people don't have complete new techniques. You can also use numbers. This is what you see a lot at IEEE. They put all the numbers of the table of comparison in the title. This can be useful, but still I don't know if they have a trick or not. So it's better to do something combined. Like if you have a technique, mention it, or an application, mention it, and put some numbers in as well. The abstract is just one paragraph, and that's basically exactly what the paper is about. So if you read the abstract, you have a kind of a super compact summary of papers. that was used in the past in libraries where you had like a box of cards where the abstracts were printed so you can quickly see if a paper was interesting, and if yes, you go to the big bookshelf and find the paper. We search in a different way on IEEE Explorer, but still an abstract is a very good way to get a quick glance of the paper. And the abstract can also have overlap with the conclusions, because conclusion is what did we learn, and the abstract is also unveiling a little bit about the conclusion, so there can be an overlap. Keywords are important, and I always tell use as many as possible, because more keywords make your paper easier to be found. You will get more citations, which is always good for the visibility of your work. Okay, let's go to the introduction. You have to describe the problem that you solve. So if it's base stations, sensor nodes, that's important. So open the subject and then zoom in to the real problem step by step. And then describe all the assumptions and the boundary conditions, like sensor nodes. Okay, it has to be low power. Maybe the energy comes from an energy harvester. Maybe that voltage from the energy harvester is high. So I'm going to use a high voltage technology, which is an old node. So basically frame your work and basically tell the readers and the reviewers where to watch and where they should focus on. So this is really important. And in the introduction also, don't make too many thinking steps at the same time. So don't squeeze everything in one paragraph, but basically every zoom in step you make, just take one paragraph for that. And that can be a short paragraph, but just take the reader by the hand and do it step by step. Describe state of the art. So tell what is the problem. So the power is too high or the bandwidth is too low. Use a lot of references. Don't be modest. So just put a lot of references here. That's nice. It's also nice for those people, and you will also be happy if your papers are cited. And reveal your basic idea early in the paper, in the introduction. So don't wait too long, because that may motivate the reader to continue. Because after introduction, you just describe the problem you work on, and then if you have then a lot of mathematics and people lose track there, they will not even see your idea. They lost interest. So better tell, I have done an invention to lower the whatever distortion with a 10 dB without any power, and I'm using that. I'm doing that with non-linear capacitors compensating non-linear junctions, something like that. And you give a little highlight of what is coming, and then the reader will think, oh, okay, that sounds good. I'm going to read the paper. And yeah, so that's good. And also cite all your own pre-publications. So all the conferences you have already written, cite those papers and tell what is different here. And that's also to guide the reviewer, because then the reviewers are less likely to tell that you try to publish the same thing twice, because you're open and transparent about it. And that gives also the reader an idea. If the reader has already read your conference paper, then the reader now knows, okay, I'm going to learn something new, and that's this. So give the outline of what comes. Then the body is most important. And yeah, you have to explain your key idea, of course. And you have to build it up step by step. So again, one thinking step at a time. So don't do too many steps. People really don't understand it. Use figures. They can help. And use simple equations that give insight. So no big equations, but just simple equations of like 2-3 centimeters long. That gives you an intuition. Like if the GM goes to infinite, the noise goes to 0. Okay, that's what people understand. So put some simple basic equations that people really understand. So don't try to show off how smart you are, but make it easy for the reader. And then prove that it makes sense. So you have an idea and then compare it with alternative ways to solve your problem, and then show indeed that you indeed have less power, or indeed your bandwidth is better. And you have to be really honest and scientific here. So give exactly your boundary conditions again, like in the introduction. Use your equation for the theory. Give your results in a comprehensive way, and compare the results or the simulations with the theory you have developed. So if I make a model that I can cancel distortion, I can show that in a calculation that the third order cancels and the fifth does not. But then I can also do a simulation. So don't wait for the measurements, but just show a clean simulation, maybe with a stylistic distortion, with a tailored description instead of a transistor, but just show that what you tell is making sense. And that gives the reader the feeling like, okay, I believe this. To continue with the body, be self-critical and realistic. So is it really a good idea? Does it make sense? Does it really do what you try to explain? So sometimes I see papers where they have a fantastic theory and the measurements show the opposite. Well, there's something wrong there. So be critical. For example, in a linearity improvement technique, okay, you make the circuit more linear, but if you burn a lot of power to make that happen, and if the noise is also increasing, well, then maybe it's not such a good idea, because you know that the power and the noise are connected. So I can also lower my noise by just scaling the impedance of my circuit. So I can just put a few circuits in parallel, for example, 10 circuits in parallel. My noise goes down with 10 dB, my power goes up with 10 dB, and I also have more dynamic range. So I can as well take an attenuator, make my input signal smaller, and then put it in the power scaled circuits, and I get the same distortion. So if you make a linearity improvement, you have to compare it with a simple power scaling, for example. And then many ideas don't make sense anymore. And another thing is it the technology or your smartness? So if you have a fantastic speed of a technology, of course you will get better numbers, but is it thanks to the technology or is it thanks to your smartness? And this also relates to the question we had before. Yes, if you have an old technology, you can still have a good improvement. So the technology should actually not matter so much in our field. Although, yeah, people use new technologies, of course. And then are practical boundary conditions met? For example, I can make a VCO at, 500 gigahertz. But if the output power is minus 30 dBm, it's totally useless. So that doesn't count. Or you make a VCO with a very good phase noise, but there's no tuning range. And you know, there's always a trade-off there with larger tuning range. Range means varactors or switches, and they all have series resistance, especially at high frequencies. So the Q goes down and your phase noise gets worse. So you always should take care of the right boundary conditions, like your competition also does. Okay, then the experimental results. And there you have to be very precise. Describe exactly what you measured and which equipment you use, but especially what did you measure? Did you correct it, etc.? So describe the setup. Don't do biotuning, and biotuning means turning the knobs on the bias every time. So I've seen A to D converters working at the supply voltage of 1.202 volt, and then if they changed the supply with a few millivolt, the whole thing didn't work. So there was just one sweet spot where the thing happened to work, and anywhere else it did not work. So that's not robust. So you have to be honest about that. Like, okay, we found a supply where it worked, but for the other ones, we still had a problem. So just be honest and don't tweak everything by hand. And also don't tune the bias for every input frequency. So I've heard people doing this, that they have a DA converter. They make, normally you plot spurious free dynamic range over frequency. And then for each frequency they make, they tune the bias again. And that's, of course, complete nonsense, because in reality, you don't make sine waves. You have other signals than sine waves, and all the sine waves are basically generated at the same time. So you cannot tune the bias for every frequency. Then you just make a digital sine wave generator. So that's not fair. So you should not do this. So you make a bias, and you don't touch it anymore, and then you do the measurement. So no biotuning. And bio means you turn the knobs. Probe or package, that's important. What equipment did you use? How many samples? Did you measure 10 samples? Tell it. Did you measure 100 samples and only one sample worked? Please tell it, because it's not fair if you don't do it. So you have to be fair about how many samples you measured. And if they're all very similar, you can say, we measured 10 samples and a typical sample looked like this and we saw a little variation. Then you're honest. So what happened with process voltage and temperature spread? Is the circuit sensitive? Did you have to put a hairdryer on your chip to make it work? Or did you put a cube of ice on it to make it work? That's, be honest, tell what you do. And if you have a precision circuit, well, you have to talk about batch to batch spread. That's important. So then also try to get that information, or at least show some simulations of batch-to-batch spread if you don't have access to multiple batches. And then an experiment must always be repeatable for practical use. So people in the industry, they would like to learn your circuits, but that means it has to be repeatable. So you really have to describe what you're doing with which equipment. And then if you have the experimental results, you should compare it with your theory and the simulations. Like, is it really do what you promised? So does your idea work? So close the loop with the theory. So then only we can learn. So then only your theory is valid. So what I always like is a bit of mathematics, a simulation to prove the mathematics, and then the measurements to prove the simulations again. Then you make a nice closed loop story. And always tell if a result is measured, simulated, or calculated. I've seen papers where they have a section called experimental results, and there was a noise over frequency, which was a total straight flat line. And I contacted the author and said, hey, is this measured or simulated? And it appeared to be a simulation, but it was in the measurement section. And the author did not tell if it was measured, simulated, or calculated. There was just written, the noise looks, or figure 5 is the noise over frequency. But every time you show a plot, tell it's measured. So repeat the word measured every time when you show something measured. Because if you don't write the word measured, I'm thinking, okay, it could also be a simulation. So be transparent. About the chip, show the chip photograph. It's also evidence that you have made a chip, and show what is what. Although we have a lot of tiling, it's hard to see. You can still draw boxes. So even if you don't see much on the chip, it's still interesting to see it also as evidence that there was a chip, and give exactly which technology you used, including all the options, because that can make a big difference. Okay, after the measurements, you should discuss the results. You can compare with prior art, so show all the relevant data plus all the papers, and the table can help. Although sometimes measurements are hard to compare because not everybody is reporting everything and not the same way. And I would say just don't focus on the numbers. It's more about the technique behind the numbers, and it also makes it less dependent on technology. So it's good to have good numbers, but always try to compare it. So if your bandwidth is so high in a certain technology, and you have a very old technology, you have less bandwidth, then it's good to normalize the bandwidth to FT or something. So make it also relative to be able to compare over different technology nodes. If you use figure of merits, use the common figure of merit definitions. There are well-known figure of merit definitions for AD converters, VCOs, phasor loops, and also for filters. But don't design your own figure of merit. Many people like to do this, so they have found a circuit, which is actually a terrible circuit, but then they make a nice figure of merit and then compare everything, and it looks fantastic. That's normally not fair. So if you define your own figure of merit, I always get very nervous. But if you do this, then do not use your figure of merit for just showing off. But there are always fundamental relationships. So power dissipation is always proportional to signal to noise and bandwidth, for example. So that makes sense. So if you have 10 dB more signal to noise, 10 times more power. These are normal things that you find in all these figure of merits. But the power dissipation divided by the number of bond pads is not a good form. I mean, it doesn't make any physical meaning. And you can just add as many bond pads as you like. You can even make a circuit with only bond pads. Then the power is 0, the bond pad number is high, and you would have a great form. So nobody cares. So don't make rubbish figure of merits. That's complete nonsense. Discuss your results. So help the reader to interpret the results. Just a table is too hard. You really have to add text and explain that. If you need absolute accuracy, like a bandgap reference or a time reference, show many samples and prove batch-to-batch robustness. And that can, if you don't have a batches, just do simulations, but say something about it. If you need matching, show more samples. Just one sample is not good. So when I worked at Philips, I made an A to D converter. The first sample I measured was fantastic. I was happy. And then I measured all the other samples and they all did not work. And I was very sensitive for mismatch, and I did not see this during the design. And I was lucky that I picked one sample that worked, but all the other ones did not. And I had to make a new design. So always test many samples. If you have calibrated circuits, tell how you calibrate it. How do you do this? Do you do it in MATLAB? What signals do you use? How long does it take? How would you do it in a real circuit? Could you do it digital? Make an estimation of the power you would need or area. Keep it practical. And this is, for example, a phase loop benchmark that I found, and where they compare it with other papers where they don't even mention the power consumption. So how can you talk about jitter if you don't know the power dissipation, since we know that jitter and power are just scaling together. So this is totally useless, a comparison like this. Writing conclusions is important. So maybe you can even start with this in your paper, because then you know towards which you want to write your paper. Make a bullet list for yourself. So just a few bullets, maybe 4, which are the main issues of your paper. And so you know where to write towards, and that gives your paper also focus. And also conclusions should be readable without reading the whole paper. So if you use abbreviations, don't use that abbreviation in the conclusion, also not in the abstract. So yeah, take the full explanation again. So if it's like TX, just use the word transmitter, or RX is receiver, then you reach much more people. So you have to convince the reader in your conclusions. And basically what the conclusions tell is, what did we learn? Then references, well, include latest state of the art for your benchmark, of course, but also refer to original papers and go back in time. Many references are older than 5 years, and people tend to really cite only the last 5 years. And that's not nice, because a long time ago, people invented the Gilbert multiplier, and you should basically cite Barry Gilbert again. But okay, some circuits are so famous, people know where they are from. But if you have old ideas, go back to the original inventors and don't cite the paper of last year that used the same trick, because many ideas are much older. Textbooks are useful to cite as well. And one thing to know is good to know is that often reviewers are the people that you cite. So if you describe state of the art or the problems, you cite papers. For an associate editor, it's very convenient to take those people, because you are trying to be better than those people. And so those people is the best to judge your work. You can also ignore reviewers. So if there's really, or you can ignore reference. If there's one competing paper that you cannot beat, and you just ignore that, then the editor can say, hey, you are ignoring that paper, which is better. I'm going to ask that author to be a reviewer. So even if you ignore a paper, that can become a reviewer. So with your reference list, you can also steer the editor towards certain reviewers. That can be in your benefit. Okay, now I come to the last part of my talk, which are general writing tips. So not about the blocks that I just did one by one, but this is more general. If a paper is too complex, then the reviewers don't understand it. If you put a lot of mathematics and big jumps, they don't understand it, they don't believe it, and the reviewers will not like it. And they basically don't want to review it again. And the best way to get rid of the paper is to reject it. So if you say, oh, it's not good, we need to improve it, then the reviewer has to read it again, and he doesn't like that, or she doesn't like it. So they will reject it, which is a pity. If it's too simplistic, then the reviewers may think, oh, it's nothing special. Even if the results are good, then the reviewer may think, oh, it's just a good technology, nothing special, reject. So you have to find the right level of complexity. Also, start with the big picture and make your problem relevant. So make sure that it's important what you've done. And take the reader by the hand, step by step, and highlight your innovation. So when your idea comes, it's good to give a sentence like, okay, our idea is to do blah, blah, blah. So that's better than we do blah, 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 blah. It's better to announce the invention. So our main idea of this paper is, and then blah, blah, blah. Then the reviewer and the readers, they are prepared to get the big innovation there. So that's easier to see the main idea. Don't put too much equations. Don't give too much theory. And don't try to make a tutorial. We have textbooks for that purpose. Okay, don't use very, like I said in the title, but just give numbers. And always be careful with the word always. Sometimes people say, yeah, always in papers, but that has to be always true. So if power dissipation is always a problem in radios, well, you can maybe find a radio where power dissipation is not a problem because it's always connected to the mains or something. So be careful in using always. So better say most of the times, or according to the author's knowledge, blah, blah, blah. But be careful with always, because the reviewer can always find one case where you are wrong. Don't use novel, because everything you write and don't cite should be novel. Use short sentences. Not everybody is native speaker. And use simple words. Don't use very difficult words. People, especially those who are not native speakers, will not understand it. And again, 1 point per paragraph. And the first or the last sentence of the paragraph is the most important. And the body of the paragraph is basically the explanation of the first or the last sentence. If you're stuck, well, sometimes people get stuck and they don't move forward. Just tell a friend what you did orally and record your voice. So just talk to a friend or somebody who does not know what you did, but it should be somebody in the field. Just explain with your hands and paper and just talk and record your voice. And then later you just type that into text, or there's even software to do that. And then you already have quite a decent paper. Also, if you have a conference paper and you have slides, on the slides normally there's more information than in the conference proceedings. If you just use the words that you're speaking at the conference and you type in those words, you roughly have the length of a journal paper already. So that's a very good starting point. So when you are doing rehearsals for your conference paper, just turn on a microphone and make a recording and convert that to text. That's a very good starting point for your journal paper. And you can polish the text later. Many people get stuck because they try to make a beautiful sentence and then they forgot what they would write in the next sentence. But just keep talking, keep the flow. And that's why talking to a friend is a really good idea, because you don't worry about the writing. So first make the storyline and then make the text beautiful. Okay, let the fellow students read and comment, because someone else always sees mistakes that you don't see. Ask a native speaker to correct the language. Even this presentation was checked by a native speaker. Keep polishing. Reviewers hate to see mistakes because they want to treat it with respect. And it's really annoying to read text with mistakes. It's no fun. And also leave room for margins and spaces. Some people, they squeeze as much as possible in the paper. They really use every piece of white stuff between the equations and put everything full. That makes a very panicked way, like you're not able to explain what you did. And yeah, it's not good to put text everywhere, make figures completely full. Just leave some white space. It's much more relaxing. It's much more pleasant to read, and it looks much less stressed. Okay, figures. Make the figures flow like a cartoon. So if you just look at the figures of the paper and you don't read the text, that you can still understand the line of the paper. That you just see block diagrams, circuits, explanations. That I always like it if I can just look at the figures, I can basically get the point of the paper. And so it's like a cartoon. All those pictures together, which have good extra information like arrows or signals, that can help. And you can add stylistic signals to the figures. So, because yeah, we engineers are quite visual people. So this is an example of a nice paper by David Murphy. He put a lot of signals in his block diagram with blockers and wanted signals and how it frequency translates. And this is very insightful. So I can understand it without reading the main text. So spend a lot of time in making good figures, because yeah, we are technical people. We're not artists. So in general, it's hard for us to make beautiful figures. And my experience as editor was that if figures are ugly, and I mean really ugly, that they look terrible, they almost always get rejected. Because if you write bad figures, if you make poor figures, you did not pay attention, then the writing is also bad. But I can even state that the design is also bad, because person who did it was making a mess of it. And also the chip is probably a mess, and probably the circuit is also a mess. So if you are messy, you will design a messy chip, and you will also make messy figures. So I did an experiment myself. So I saw the paper coming in with terrible figures, and I said, okay, I put this one on my list and check if it's rejected. And yeah, it always got rejected. So it's true. And it's not the opposite is true, that if the figures are beautiful, that it's always accepted, but it really helps. Okay, then a few things to conclude is to show some things that you should not do. So don't publish the same material elsewhere, because the reviewers and the readers, they will see this. So it's unethical to publish the same work twice or 3 times, and it will always pop up. So people will always find this. Also, don't change your paper after acceptance and before publications. So don't remove a reference to the competitor, because the reviewers, they will see this later and you are in trouble. So don't mess with the reviewers. Don't use someone else's ideas. Don't steal ideas, because someone else is reading too. And that person will see it, and he will or she will not be happy. Also, don't hide unpleasant measurements. So if you have a chip that doesn't work, or most chips don't work, or something is oscillating, be honest, talk about it and explain why it oscillates. And if it does not oscillate, explain what you did to make it not oscillate. But don't hide it. Don't try to not talk about it, because we are all smart people. People will find it. And what you don't like is that if you have a published paper, somebody writes a comment and tells you that your circuit cannot work. That's very painful. So better explain what is the weak point of your circuit and how you solved it. Also, never falsify any results. So never tune the bias for each measurement point, like I described. That's falsification. Also, don't make multiple chips. So if I make an op-amp, I can make 3 op-amps, and I show one photograph, but I can make 3 op-amps which are different designs. And I can, for example, with op-amp 1, I can measure the gain. Op-amp 2, I can measure the noise. And op-amp 3, I can measure the distortion. But if I don't tell I have 3 op-amps, I can just say, well, I've made an op-amp, and this is the measured noise, this is the measured gain, this is the measured distortion. But I don't say that these are different circuits, and that's not fair. That's not allowed. That's totally unethical and totally falsification. Or people even completely falsify circuits. So I had a very famous author, you can find back who that is, who falsified over 60 papers. He glued photos together, fabricated measurement results. He basically photoshopped complete papers. And well, that paper became that person became kind of famous. So it's not good to really falsify results. People will find out, really, and you're in trouble. It's really the end of your career. So don't do this, please. Okay, I'm at the end. To summarize, I explained first before the break how things work, conferences, journal, how the process works, and how the order is. And then after the break, I explained to you about the more technical writing part, step by step, and some general writing tips. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention. This is also a way to publish your work. You throw it in the ocean and see who finds it. It's kind of open access, but the audience is kind of limited. Thank you for your attention.
So thank you, Bram. So this concludes the presentation. So we will now continue with the Q&A sessions. So first questions. What are your tips for the first ever research paper for fresh graduates?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
What are your tips for the first ever research paper from a fresh graduate student?
The tips for the first paper. What we do with our own students, PhD students, I ask them the first 9 months to write the first 2 chapters of the thesis. So it's not a paper, it's to write the thesis, first 2 chapters. So it's not going to be published. It's basically introduction to the subject and the literature overview. And there we get feedback. So this way the student learns how to write. And so it's not yet a paper, it's more the introduction of the thesis, which needs to be written anyway. And there we help the the student. So we guide the student, and if it's not good, we will explain it. And then if the student starts the real paper, then there's some experience. And then also with the real first paper, as a professor, we really guide the student a lot. We give a lot of feedback, and also the student gets education credits for that, because we do a lot of guidance in the first paper. So the first paper, we really take the student by the hand and give a lot of feedback, detailed feedback, explaining what to do. And another tip is, watch this video and get some tips. But yeah, it's good to practice on something less important than a paper, where you can still make mistakes, and just try it, just do it. The best way to learn it is just by doing it.
Okay, thank you. So next question. So earlier you mentioned that the idea for a paper can be small for a conference paper. So can you elaborate more on this, maybe with some specific examples? What is a small circus for the conference paper?
Yeah, I think a typical example is like a VCO, with a little trick. Maybe put an inductor in the tail, or a trick to make the supply sensitivity better. So at conferences, you see more and more quite big chips, especially at ISSCC. You see complete receivers with ADCs and digital parts, and well, it's sad that they like those big papers, because personally I like smaller ideas where you can focus more on the transistor level. So any block, an LNA, mixer, ADC, or comparator, that's small enough for a conference. And even you can write still a journal paper about the comparator easily. And also the paper you submit for the journal solid state can be 8 pages, but you don't have to make 8 pages. You can also do 6 pages or 5 pages. So it's just the maximum, but people somehow always go to the maximum. But if you have a little idea, which is still cute, you can also write a short journal paper about it, and just keep it shorter.
Okay, so I think, we'll have our last question. So is it still possible to submit a journal paper a long time, like 1 or 2 years after the conference paper has been published?
Yes, that's possible. Of course, you should include the latest benchmark. So in your conference paper, you did a comparison with state of the art. In those 2 years, there may have been other papers published. So you should maybe add the comparison table, add the recent works. If not, the reviewers will tell you to do so. But yeah, you can still publish the paper much later. So we had several papers where we did the conference paper, and then the real paper came sometimes 3 years later. And if it's still interesting, that's still allowed. But it should be interesting at that moment. So if the idea has been bypassed by other techniques which are just better, in your table of contents you completely lose from the last 2 years, well, then it's hard to get accepted. But if your idea is still competitive, yes, it doesn't matter.
Okay, so thank you, Bram. So I think that's all for the our webinar today. And thank you for your participation today. And as a reminder, the webinar will be posted on the SSCS Resource Center and also YouTube channel for future viewing. For information on upcoming webinars, please visit the SSCS website. Thank you. Goodbye.
Okay.
Thank you, Bram.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.